the farmer. Lost legend, national treasure, and official folk hero of Old West Montana. The life and times of Nelson, Nels McGillen, 1840 to 1922. Compiled and narrated by R.J. McGillen, with archival collaboration by OpenAI's GPT-5 for submission to the Montana Historical Society. Part 1. Prologue and the Orphan of the Illinois River, 1840 to 1855. I stand in the wind just north of Red Lodge, Montana, where the cottonwoods lean toward the Beartooths, their branches whispering against the long horizon. The old fence line creaks, the grass is stiff with sun, and there, half sunk into the earth, lies the simple marble stone that began this entire journey. Nelson A. McGillen, 1840 to 1922. No epitaph, no regiment, no mark of the life behind the years, just a name carved into time. I first found him not in the earth, but in ink. A single, brittle obituary in the Red Lodge News, July 3, 1922. The line read, "In the historical Indian fighting during the Big Hole Battle, Mr. McGillen was dispatch bearer and successfully delivered a message from General Howard to General Gibbons, although ambushed several times, which had an important bearing on the outcome of the battle." That sentence was all the world remembered of him. A single, misprinted paragraph about a man whose name had been bent by clerks and typesetters for 80 years. Some wrote it McGilliam, others McGillian, a few McGillen. But here, in this soil, in this wind, the truth of him waited to be found again. His trail began far from Montana, on the slow, brown waters of the Illinois River. Nelson Anthony McGillen was born on October 8, 1840, in Pleasant Plains, Sangamon County, Illinois, the eldest son of William McGillen, a riverman, and Alzira Cruson McGillen, daughter of the early Cruson settlers of Morgan County. His father worked the river landings between Naples, Beardstown, and Grafton, loading wood, hauling freight, and piloting the low-deck packets that plied the water between St. Louis and Peoria. The McGillens lived a life tethered to the current. Long days of river silt, steamboat whistles, and coal smoke that smeared the horizon gray. But in the summer of 1850, the cholera came. It moved north along the Mississippi like a ghost wind, striking Grafton, Beardstown, and Naples within weeks. Entire families died before sunset. Wagons rolled through the muddy streets bearing the dead wrapped in bedsheets. William and Alzira both fell ill within days of each other. They were buried in the river bluff soil above Beardstown, two graves that no stone now marks. At 10 years old, Nelson was an orphan. He and his younger siblings, Mary, John, and a baby lost to the records, were taken in by the Cruson family near Morgan County, where his grandmother tended him with the rough tenderness of frontier women who had already buried too much. The Crusons were French-descended Protestants, farmers, and ferrymen, and it was there, among their stories of flatboats and faith, that Nelson first learned endurance. By 12, he was back at the river landings, earning pennies driving oxen for freight teams and helping load the packet steamers that ran the Illinois line. The men called him Little Nels. He watched their ropes coil and their cargo lists fill, and he learned the great unspoken rule of the river, that a man's word meant everything, because out there was nothing else. He could read a barometer before he could write his name. He learned to gauge the depth of a channel by the color of its swirl. And in the evenings, sitting on the pilings at Naples Landing, he listened to the talk of men heading west. Stories of California, of gold and river sand, of a new world beyond the prairies. When the cholera took his parents, the Illinois became his family. When it receded, it left him with a hunger for motion. He would later tell a friend, though the friend's name is lost, that he never felt at home unless there was water moving or wheels turning under him. The river hardened him. It gave him calluses and silence. By the age of 15, he was hauling for Anderson and Hale Freight Outfit, the same company that would later supply Union forts during the war. He drove the mule teams that ran between Jacksonville, Naples, and Springfield, sleeping under the wagons, waking before dawn to the smell of canvas and iron. Those years shaped him into the man who would one day cross half the continent on foot and horseback, through war and wilderness, carrying messages that could decide the fate of armies. But for now, he was just an orphan boy learning to keep his bearings in a world that kept taking things away. By 1855, when he was 15, the Illinois River began to freeze more often. The freight slowed. The talk of California grew louder. Steamers were leaving St. Louis for New Orleans, and men from Beardstown were joining wagon companies bound for the Western Territories. Nelson stood on the levee one gray morning, watching a flatboat push out into the current, and whispered to himself, "West." That single word would carry him for the next 70 years, through deserts, mountains, and the heart of Montana itself. Part 2. The War, the Gold Roads, and the Journey West, 1856 to 1865. When I trace Nelson's trail through the 1860s, the ink fades where the nation itself was breaking. The Civil War loomed, and the young men of Illinois answered their country's call. Among the names on the Cartwright Township draft roll of 1863, a neat hand records, Nelson McGillen, age 22, farmer. No regiment follows the entry, just that single line, and yet it places him in the story of a generation. Most men drafted in Sangamon and Morgan counties went into service with the 73rd Illinois Volunteer Infantry, or served as teamsters under the Union Quartermaster Corps. It was here, historians believe, that Nelson found his calling. Not as a soldier behind a musket, but as a wagon master and guide in the supply lines that stretched from St. Louis to Fort Leavenworth, Council Bluffs, and beyond. I imagine him at dawn, the mules stamping, the wheels creaking, and the officers shouting to move out. The wagons carried uniforms, powder, rifles, and sacks of grain, the sinew of the war that moved westward with every mile of the campaign. Nelson drove through rain and sleet, fording rivers, keeping to the roads that were less traveled because the safer ones were clogged with troops. He wasn't a man for speeches. He was the one you sent when you needed a load delivered and didn't have time to explain how to do it. Those were the years when he learned how to cross flooded plains without losing a wheel, how to repair a wagon axle with greenwood, and how to find water when the riverbeds were dust. When the guns fell silent in 1865, the Union was stitched together again. But for men like Nelson, there was no home to return to. His parents were gone, his siblings scattered. The war had given him discipline and silence, and the endless West was still calling. So he turned his eyes toward California. The word itself was a spell. Men whispered it in saloons and along river docks, California, Grass Valley, Downeyville, Eureka. The gold rush had cooled, but freighting was booming. The miners needed tools, and the merchants needed men who knew how to move goods through bad country. That spring, Nelson joined a westbound train of Anderson and Hale wagons hauling for the government's reconstruction efforts. They rolled south through St. Louis, then along the Santa Fe Trail before cutting west toward Salt Lake City. There, they met with a line of freighters under Ben Holliday's Overland Stage Company, running supplies to the Pacific mines. Nelson drove a 4-yoke ox team, 8 great beasts trudging through the salt flats, bells clanging, the sun burning white on the sand. It was there that he learned independence in its purest form. For 5 years, he lived on the road between Sacramento, Grass Valley, Downeyville, and Eureka, hauling crates of pickaxes, shovels, dried beans, and dynamite to the miners, then returning with gold dust sealed in oilcloth. The mountains tested him with snow and loneliness. The men tested him with cards and whiskey. He passed both tests by keeping his head and his word. He met Chinese laborers who had crossed the ocean to blast tunnels through granite, and Mormon teamsters moving north with their families and wagons bound for Idaho. From them, Nelson learned routes that did not appear on maps. The forgotten trails, the water holes, the mountain passes no government survey had marked yet. By the early 1860s, he had followed those routes north through the Siskiyou Mountains and into the new Idaho Territory. He drove freight to Lewiston, Walla Walla, and Fort Lapwai, meeting missionaries, soldiers, and native traders. Each mile carried him deeper into a land that was still raw and ungoverned, a place where treaties were promises written in wind. It was during one of those long freight runs, somewhere near the confluence of the Clearwater and the Snake, that he heard of a new road being built, an engineered miracle called the Mullen Road. It stretched from Walla Walla to Fort Benton, linking the Pacific with the upper Missouri. Nelson joined a company of teamsters ferrying supplies along it for a time, and by 1865 he was pushing through Lolo Pass into the country that would one day become Montana. The world he entered then was vast and green and untamed. The Bitterroot Valley opened like a cathedral, ringed by snowy peaks and fed by rivers as clear as glass. It was here, at Fort Owen, that Nelson first saw the future he hadn't known he was looking for. The fort, run by Major John Owen, was both trading post and refuge, the heart of the valley's fragile peace between the Salish, the Nez Perce, and the first waves of settlers. Nelson found work immediately, mending wagons, splitting rails, and helping the incoming Chaffin-Mitchell wagon train build shelter for the winter of 1864 to 1865. Among that company was Anthony Chaffin, a Virginian turned frontiersman, his wife Mary, and their children, Newton, Nancy, and several others. They had come north from Bannock and Alder Gulch, drawn by fertile soil and the promise of stability. Nelson, who had spent his life in motion, found in their camp something he had not known since childhood: family. The Chaffins welcomed him, and he proved himself useful. When oxen strayed, Nelson found them. When the wagon axles broke, he repaired them. He stayed after the spring thaw and built his own cabin near theirs on the west side of the valley, close enough that he could hear the evening fiddle music drifting over the sage. Neighbors soon knew his name. John Woody, Peter Whaley, James Wiles, and Louis Paul, a French Salish interpreter, all spoke of him in their diaries as a quiet but steady man who never raised his voice, but when he spoke, the dogs stopped barking. He traded with the Salish, learned their words for mountain and water, bear, creek, and carried tobacco and flour to their camps when winters were lean. In return, they taught him to track elk, to listen for the language of ravens, and to watch for the shadow of strangers long before they arrived. Those early Bitterroot years shaped him as surely as the Illinois River had. He became, in the words of an early settler, half soldier, half mountain ghost. It was here, in these years between peace and storm, that the legend of Nels McGillen began to take root. Part 3. The Salish Legend and the Battle of the Big Hole, 1868 to 1877. In the Bitterroot Valley, seasons carry memory like water carries silt. Somewhere between the winters of 1868 and 1873, a story began to circulate among the Salish and the new settlers of 3 Mile Creek and Stevensville. Old men retold it to children beside winter fires. Missionaries later scribbled a version into their journals. They said it was about a man called Nels, a trapper and freighter who spoke 2 tongues and walked the forest as if he belonged to both nations. One night, Nels heard movement around his wagon. A shape slid between the pines, young, fast, and silent, except for the faint chime of a metal clasp. He caught the boy before he reached the harness. The youth kicked, clawed, cursed in Salish. Nels tied him to a tree with rawhide. Then he sat down, fed the fire, and waited. From the darkness came another sound, a second boy running through the underbrush. Nels caught only a glimpse, bare shoulders, the flash of hair, the sound of moccasins slapping through the slough. He smiled. For 2 nights he kept the first captive fed and watered, trying to speak in broken Salish. At last the boy said, in careful English, "You talk like a child." Nels laughed and answered, "Then you teach me." On the 3rd night, the first boy's friends returned, 4 of them this time, creeping through the thicket to cut the rawhide. They triggered a snare Nels had hung in the spruce. The net dropped, tangled them like fish. When they stopped thrashing, he hauled them into camp and tied them each to a different tree. What followed became legend. Nels told stories until dawn, of the Illinois River, of wagon trains crossing deserts, of men who could smell rain before it fell. He spoke of the ways of white men and the loneliness of the frontier. Then, before sunrise, he untied the first captive and said, "Go home. Bring your chief. Only he can speak for you." By midday, the chief arrived, old, dignified, tired of youthful bravado. He looked at the bound boys, then at Nels, and said quietly, "You are the one who walks with both tongues." He scolded the young men for dishonor and invited Nels to his fire the following moon. That story, half myth, half memory, spread through the valley. Some said it proved the Salish respected him. Others said it showed he feared no man. For Nels himself, it was simply a night's work in a lifetime of uneasy peace. But it would become part of the mosaic that made him a folk figure long before history bothered to write his name. By the mid-1870s, the Bitterroot was changing. Homesteads multiplied, and Major John Owen's old fort became a hub for freighters and scouts. The Nez Perce, under Chief Joseph, Looking-Glass, and Whitebird moved east after years of broken treaties, seeking to rest in their ancestral hunting grounds near the Bitterroot. Nels, fluent in both English and enough Salish and Nez Perce to parley, was summoned by Captain Charles Ron and interpreter Michel Rivet to help with the first councils at Fort Owen and Victor Agency. He remembered those days as tense but hopeful. He sat by the fire with Looking-Glass and Whitebird, listening as they pleaded not to be driven north again. "We want to live like you," Joseph said through Rivet. "We will plant where our fathers planted." But Washington wanted clear boundaries. Settlers wanted safety. Ron was ordered to hold the line, and the summer of 1877 erupted into the Nez Perce War. Nels joined Captain J. L. Humble's Corvallis detachment as a civilian courier attached to General O. O. Howard's command. He rode messages between Howard's column and Colonel John Gibbon's forces marching from Fort Missoula. Humble later wrote in the Missoulian that his courier, spelled Nels McGillen, was paid $200 for a single dispatch, about $6,700 today, to carry word of the Nez Perce movements through hostile country. On the nights of August 9th and 10th, 1877, the valley was ablaze. Gibbon's men struck the Nez Perce camp on the Big Hole River before dawn. Women and children fled into the trees as rifle fire tore the fog apart. Howard was still days away, unaware of the slaughter. Nels rode through the crossfire to reach him, spurring his horse across the river where bullets hissed like hornets. When he returned with orders for reinforcements, his coat was ripped and the bay he rode was bleeding from 2 grazes. The Nez Perce escaped the encirclement and fled south toward Yellowstone. In later years, Nels never bragged of the ride. When others told the story, he only said, "Messages are worth the man who carries them." After the war, he collected his pay and walked away from the army with nothing but his horse and his rifle. The soldiers moved on. Nels stayed. He returned to the Bitterroot, where the cottonwoods whispered peace again, and where a young woman named Nancy Chaffin waited at her father's homestead near Bird Creek. Part 4. Marriage, the Red Lodge Claim, and the Later Years, 1878 to 1922. I picture the wedding in February 1878 as small and practical. Nancy Ann Chaffin, barely 20, the youngest daughter of Anthony and Mary Chaffin, standing in a wool dress before a handful of neighbors near Bird Creek. The snow still lay deep under the cottonwoods. The only music was the creak of the cabin walls in the wind. I imagine Nels smiling awkwardly, the freighter's hands too rough for ceremony. They signed the license, Nelson A. McGillen and Nancy A. Chaffin, and 2 witnesses, Robert Nichols and Nettie Hoff, wrote their names beneath marriage record, Missoula County, 1878. They built a cabin close to the Chaffin Ranch near Corvallis. The new household quickly filled with work and with life. Nancy kept a small garden and helped midwife neighbor women. Nels freighted lumber and grain to Fort Missoula and sometimes as far as Bannock. He was a quiet man, but a reliable one, and in the small frontier community that meant more than eloquence. Neighbors remembered them at gatherings with the Woody, Whaley, and Wiles families. Louis Paul, the old Salish interpreter, visited often. Sometimes he and Nels would sit on the porch and switch between English and Salish phrases until the children laughed at their strange mixed talk. When disputes flared between ranchers and tribesmen over stray cattle, Nels was often sent to interpret. He was never entirely trusted by either side, yet both listened to him. By 1885, the valley was crowded. The railroad was coming. Surveyors cut lines through hayfields. The Chaffins talked of moving east toward the coal country newly opening around Red Lodge in Carbon County. Nels agreed to scout it. He rode east over the passes, through Anaconda and Deer Lodge, and saw the wide grasslands rolling toward the Pryor Mountains. Good water, good soil, he later wrote on a scrap found among his papers. In 1886, the McGillens and Chaffins loaded wagons and went east. Red Lodge was then a scatter of tents, a blacksmith, and the smell of coal smoke. Nels filed a 15-acre homestead north of town. It should have been simple, but others had already staked overlapping claims. For nearly 10 years, he fought squatters and bureaucrats, writing to the U.S. Land Office in Helena and the General Land Office in Washington, D.C. The Anaconda Standard finally recorded the victory, land case decision. Nelson McGillen, Red Lodge District entitled to 15 acres. Anaconda Standard, April 29, 1895. That parcel, worth perhaps $1,000 then, became his kingdom. He celebrated not with whiskey but by planting cottonwoods along the irrigation ditch he had dug by hand. Those trees still stand, gray, bent, and whispering like old soldiers. Frontier life was seldom quiet. One clipping from the Red Lodge picket tells of Justice J. L. Miskamine's first case, Mrs. Nanny McGillen versus Mrs. Lunchberry, disturbance of the peace. The fine was $5, approximately $175 today. The story, half comic and half tragic, shows Nancy's fierce loyalty and the small dramas of a mining town where everyone knew everyone else's temper. Through the 1890s, Red Lodge grew around them. The coal boom brought immigrants, Finns, Italians, Scots. Nels hauled freight to the mines, sold hay, and offered advice to newcomers. He never stopped watching the hills. Even in old age, he walked the ridge above his fields each evening, scanning the tree line as if expecting riders. When asked why, he only said, "Old habits die slower than old men." Nancy sickened around 1900 and died that winter. She was buried in John Henry Cemetery. Nels marked the grave with a plain board and later replaced it with an upright standing, large, flat engraved marble stone. He stayed on the land with his children until they married or moved west. Census records from 1900 and 1910 list him living with daughter Florence. The handwriting wavers, but the occupation line still reads, "Farmer." Old comrades visited when they passed through Montana. Captain Ron, gray and stooped, stopped once on his way to Missoula. Colonel Gibbon, touring veteran reunions, mentioned a good courier named McGillen in a speech at Helena. And Captain J. L. Humble, whose article had preserved Nelson's deed at Big Hole, sent a letter that Nelson kept folded in a Bible until he died. He outlived nearly all of them. By 1922, Red Lodge had automobiles on its streets and electric lights in its saloons. Nelson, 81, still walked to town every Sunday. On June 30th, 1922, he died quietly at home. His death certificate lists occupation, farmer, informant, James McGillen, son. They buried him beside Nancy under the cottonwoods. The plaque left is simple, nothing at all like his life. Nelson A. McGillen, 1840 to 1922. He left no portrait. Every photograph taken in those years shows someone else, his wife, his children, his neighbors, but never him. It is as though he chose to live between frames, invisible except in the stories that survive. Part 5, Epilogue, Rediscovering the Lost Legend, 1922 to present. When I began tracing Nelson's life, there was almost nothing left but fragments. A name carved wrong in military notes, an obituary with a single paragraph, a handful of yellowed clippings from the Red Lodge News and Anaconda Standard, and a death certificate stamped June 30th, 1922. Yet, when I followed those fragments west, from the bluffs of Beardstown to the slopes of the Beartooths, a whole life rose out of the dust. It's strange how history hides its best people. For every general or outlaw cast in bronze, there are 1,000 men like Nelson Nels McGillen, men who rode hard roads for little glory and left their mark only in the whisper of rivers and the trees they planted. His name was nearly erased, not because he failed to matter, but because he moved through history doing the work others wrote about. If you stand on the old Chaffin homestead near Stevensville, you can still see what he saw in 1865. The blue peaks of the Bitterroots, the glint of the creek below, the trails worn by elk and men. Those same hills once held the Salish boys of his forest tale, now passed into tribal legend as the story of the white trapper who tied up 5 and made friends of them all. It remains one of the few frontier stories told with affection on both sides of the line, a rare reminder that peace, even in a violent century, was possible when men chose understanding over fear. He became a bridge figure, a man fluent enough in Salish to parley with chiefs, trusted enough by soldiers to carry orders through battle, and humble enough to return to his farm when history's noise faded. Among those who survived Big Hole, his name was spoken with quiet respect. A courier named McGillen, Captain Humble wrote, who rode where no one else would and came back alive. Even the land remembers him. The 15 acres north of Red Lodge where he dug his irrigation ditch and planted cottonwoods are still green from his work. The ditch, lined with old stone, still runs cold water from the spring above the ridge. It is, in a way, his final signature, a line of life carved through arid soil. In the archives of the Montana Historical Society, there will soon be a file bearing his correct name, Nelson Anthony McGillen, 1840 to 1922. Inside it will rest the copied records of his parents William and Alzira McGillen, both taken by cholera on the Illinois River, the 1863 draft roll listing him as a teamster, the land patents from 1895 confirming his Red Lodge claim, the obituary and Captain Humble's dispatch pay record, and the photographs his descendants preserved of his headstone, his family, and the country he loved. Those papers, humble as they are, mark his return to the story of Montana. For over 70 years, historians wrote of the Bitterroot pioneers, of Owen, Woody, Whaley, Chaffin, but his name lingered as a footnote, misspelled or forgotten. Now, pieced together through patient research and family memory, he stands again where he belongs, not just as a participant in the Battle of the Big Hole, but as one of the rare men who span the frontier's two worlds, soldier and settler, scout and friend, orphan and patriarch. If there is a moral to his story, it is this: legends don't have to be loud to be lasting. Nelson McGillen's life was the quiet kind of heroism, the kind that doesn't end in a monument or a bullet, but in a life well lived across impossible distances. He was born to a river, carried west on faith and wagon wheels, and buried beneath the cottonwoods he planted by hand. He never wrote his own memoir, so this, pieced from records, stories, and the memories of those who kept his name alive, is the voice he never raised, finally speaking again through time,